Hello and welcome to the Why the Mountains podcast with me, your host, Stephen Farley. This is the third and final part of our interview with Paul Devaney. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes with Paul, I suggest you do that first before continuing. In this episode, we will hear about Paul's experience on Everest in 2015, a tragic year for the people of Nepal, as the country experienced a magnitude 7.9 earthquake, which occurred on the 25th of April, right in the middle of the Everest Spring season. Obviously, this was devastating for the people of Nepal, but for this podcast we will focus on the impact at base camp and above on Everest. I hope you enjoy. I start off by asking Paul how he felt being back on Everest.
Oh, fantastic. It felt really good. The training, we changed up the training and the preparation beforehand, and I felt much more powerful going in 2015 than I did in 14. I felt more confident. I enjoyed Island Peak. We ran up Island Peak, ran back. That was just awesome. Fantastic.
Ran up Island Peak. Very good.
Oh, that's a slight exaggeration, but we set up our camp at the head wall at 6,000 meters. And we had a kind of wake up in the morning and head up to the summit bit. We didn't have the very long push for the summit. And we just spent time up there, in the camps, just breathing the air and just enjoying it. And I felt really, really strong. And of course, you're going in 2015 thinking, well, what's the chances it's going to be another disaster, 2 in a row? That won't happen. So you kind of have these little hidden confidences as well. And yeah, I felt fantastic. And then we got into the icefall, which we didn't the previous year. And the icefall route was completely different. And it was more towards if you're facing the icefall from the Nepal side, more towards the right side this year. And the condition of the icefall was fantastic. And yeah, we got part of the way up there the previous day, the day before the earthquake. And everything just felt really good. Felt that we're on it this time. The team was really good. Everything felt really great.
After what happened to the Sherpa in the icefall in 2014, which resulted in closing the mountain down on the south side for the year, it's fair enough for Paul to think he might get a more straightforward attempt in 2015, but alas, it was not to be. I asked Paul to describe what happened and how long it took him to figure out it was an actual earthquake.
A few minutes. We don't know what's happening, and it's misty, and the ground starts moving, and I'd never been in an earthquake before. And so we're all kind of feeling the ground moving under us, swaying almost. Run outside, and you look up into the ice. We're at the very mouth of the icefall, our camp. So we're looking right up into the icefall, and it's all mist. And I'm thinking, icefall must have collapsed. And I'm thinking that partly because of what happened the previous year. And, there's little avalanches all the time. But I'm thinking the whole icefall must be collapsing. And then you're thinking, well, if it's collapsing, is it going to appear out of that mist? And should you probably just leg it in the other direction? And then the French guy in our team just shouted, it's an earthquake. It's an earthquake. And like we'd never, that word just didn't enter the lexicon of your preparation. There hadn't been a major one in Nepal since the 1930s. Although it's an earthquake-prone zone, there are tremors, there are small earthquakes. There hadn't been a major one since the 30s. There hadn't been a major earthquake during an Everest season in the history of the climbed Everest phase from 53 to now. So yeah, it just was wild. It's wild to feel the entire glacier under you just swaying, and everything's moving. The mountains are moving, everything's moving. So you can't compare what's happening to you to something over there that's still, everything was moving. That was bizarre. And we didn't know what to do. What do you do? It's an earthquake. Like, where do you run? If you were going to run, where would you run to?
Where do you run in an earthquake? I hope I never have to ask myself that question for real. When the earthquake struck, the people in Everest Base Camp naturally looked up to Everest and the icefall for the immediate danger, partly because of the experience in 2014 and partly because it's always the focus for climbers when they are there. Everest Base Camp is positioned to provide access to the route, but also because it is in a relatively safe zone, down on the glacier. Avalanches would not usually trouble the people at Base Camp. This was usually a problem for those higher up. However, as Paul explains, the real danger was coming from behind them, from Pumori.
Pumori, yeah. There's a ridge between Pumori and I think Lingtran is the other peak along the way. And The earthquake had shook off all the ice and snow off that ridge, and it had fallen about 1,000 meters and then splashed onto a plateau that's just adjacent to base camp. And it had just created a massive shockwave. And that shockwave just started to move towards base camp and picked up everything along the way. And by the time we saw it coming out of the mist, it was just a wall of white plume. Now, it had lost a lot of its energy by the time it got to our camp, but we didn't know that. We just saw plume coming as high as we could see and as wide as we could see coming out of the mist. And you've got a second to react. So we ran inside and got under the table in the mess tent because that was the only thing that had any cover that we thought we could get. Now, I mean, you're running into a plastic bag effectively and getting under some, some deck chairs, tables. And it's not the cleverest idea in the world, but you just want to put something between you, something structure between you and what was coming at you. And then you've got a couple of seconds when you're under there to ruminate about the fact that there's something coming at you. What am I going to do now? I remember sitting there and thinking, we're going to get thrown into the icefall now. We're going to get launched into the icefall. So I have to prepare myself for the fact that we're going to get launched into the icefall. What happens then, I don't know. But we're going to get launched into the icefall. It hit the base camp like an atomic bomb, and it basically rolled through the middle of it and tore everything apart. So, I mean, the energy was gone when it got to us because it had expended the energy, tearing out the whole heart of base camp. And we were unaware of that because every little encampment is kind of isolated from the next one. And we had to go over a little wall and then we could see the rest of base camp. So it wasn't until we emerged and everything's covered obviously in snow. And you emerge and you think, well, the camp's intact. That wasn't so bad. And then you get out of your camp and you get over this little wall and you look out and it's a plane crash as far as you can see. And it took a while. We started walking. One of the Angus brothers who run expeditions in Everest, they came running in and he was covered like very thick layers of snow. He came running looking for oxygen cylinders. And he wanted to go into the icefall because I think his brother was up on Camp 1 or something like that. And that's the first thing we got in a sense that, all right, this might not have affected us the same way it affected everyone else. And then the radio started to crack and everyone was looking for oxygen. So we started to walk towards the center of base camp. And as we started to walk, it's about 1 kilometer base camp. So we were about at the edge of it. So we're walking maybe half a kilometer. You start to see just this debris everywhere and no camps and just all of the bits and pieces that might have made up a camp just embedded in the snow. And it just resembled a plane crash. You get to the center of camp and the medical tent was still standing amazingly. I think one of the doctors had taken a pretty bad knock to the leg, but they were up and working. And so we just said, what do you need? And they put you to work.
Paul and everybody else who was still able got to work. But the heart had been ripped out of base camp. It wasn't immediately clear the extent of the damage and the injuries, but it was catastrophic. I asked Paul about how an emergency response gets going in such a remote place under these circumstances.
It's fairly organic because every team is kind of its own little principality. And then you have the expedition owners who will have meetings themselves to manage things like the logistics of what order teams are going to go in so that everyone isn't in the icefall at the same time or everyone isn't in Camp 1. So there is some sort of organized chaos where the biggest teams kind of steer the way in how we should all get up and down this mountain. And the team leadership will all come together at various points throughout the season to try and figure out that. But in terms of what happens at base camp, well, I mean, there's never been a disaster at base camp. And base camp was seen as so far removed from the areas that could potentially have the problem that it wouldn't be somewhere that you'd have to think about having an emergency response. It was a misty day, so the helicopters couldn't get through. And so it kind of became it was very organic the way that the emergency response happened. The biggest teams had most of their people up at Camp 1 and Camp 2 at the time, so their tents were empty. And that was very fortunate. Two was fortunate for the people up there, but it was very fortunate that those base camps ended up being emptied because very quickly, IMG decided, right, we have a few doctors here. We're going to set up all of our mess tents and everything else. We're going to open them out. And so anyone with long bone fractures, impact wounds, bring them to us. And then Russell Bryce's team, HIMEX, they had the walking wounded, I think, of theirs. And there was a few other tents around that. And that was all on the far side. So the opposite side of base camp to the icefall. And that's the side where the helicopters would land. So it would land right adjacent to where the IMG camp was. So very quickly, the boss of those teams was up on rocks with walkie-talkies starting to direct people. And that sort of found its way through to the medical people in the center. So the medical people in the center were coordinating via walkie-talkies and saying, right, send this person to IMG's camp that way, go. So we would lift our stretcher, off we go to IMG. So you got about half a kilometer across base camp to get with somebody in a stretcher, get them to IMG, and then back you go again. Or you might be running water and medical supplies between camps so you just, everyone's kind of taking on whatever role. If you were a doctor before you went to the mountain, you became a doctor again. If you were logistics, that's what you done. The rest was just carried stuff around. Everyone got busy, and it's amazing how it coalesced into something that appeared from the outside to be extremely well organized, but was completely organic. There was a few people on the edge of the icefall. One of them I know, a lad from north of England, and they legged it out of. They were just getting out of the icefall when it happened. There was nobody, I don't think, in the middle of the icefall because of the time of day. So the people who would have been in the icefall at that point were the slow people. Well, let me rephrase that. There were the people who were slow in their progress to Camp 1 that day. Because you start off for Camp 1, just after midnight. And the idea is to get through the icefall at nighttime while the crevasses are at their least wide. So if you're in the icefall at 11:30, you're struggling to make progress to Camp 1, and most people were out of the icefall. So that's a lucky thing, because the icefall, like you say, the icefall was it wasn't completely destroyed, but it was certainly put beyond use. Yeah, there was about 170 people between Camp 1 and Camp 2, including a couple of our Sherpa who had gone up to do some supply runs. So the immediate requirement was to take the badly injured. There was about 60 badly injured by the time the day was finished, who needed to be fished down to Kathmandu. So next morning, the first priority was they were shipped out of there and down to Kathmandu. And once you had the wounded from base camp out, then the helicopters turned around and spent the day just darting through the cloud to get up to Camp 1 to pick up everyone from Camp 1 and 2. And that was heroic stuff. Like, we watched these we were completely expecting a helicopter crash because there was so much activity, and the weather was, it was borderline at times. And those pilots just performed heroics, and they got everyone back down to base camp. And of course, people came back down to base camp, and there was no camp to come back to. Their entire operation had been completely wiped out. So it was there was a requirement then to get some people who were in base camp out of base camp, so that you had space to put the people in who were coming down from Camp 1 and Camp 2. And again, a lot of that was kind of organic enough, organized chaos. But a lot of the folks who were on these expeditions have done a lot of logistical preparation of their own beforehand, and have thought a lot about it, and have studied the mountain and whatever. So they're not bringing zero skill to the game in terms of what to do and how to do it. They're bringing a bit of forethought, and that kind of kicked in big time when it was needed for the emergency response.
A disaster of this size in Nepal, especially one having such an impact at Everest, a place full of mountaineers from all over the world, is a global news story, and one which will be hitting the news desks fairly quickly, causing alarm at home. I asked Paul about how communications were affected, and if the news of the disaster made it home before Paul could tell his family he was okay.
That was one of the bit of preparations we'd done for the previous year. The previous year in 2014, I was climbing with a lad called Niall from Kildare, who was doing the Seven Summits with me, and I think his mother found out about the avalanche by waking up and turning on RT radio.
Oh.
And we thought, that's not going to happen again. So we had a protocol where if anything went sideways here, and we would immediately get the satellite phone, make a call, 2-3 minutes call to say, everything's fine, here's what's happened, we'll call you the next time we get time. And that's what we done. And it was no more than a couple of minutes so my brother, who was at home in Longford, walked downstairs, because it was very early morning, walked downstairs and woke my mum up and said, he's okay, here's what's happened. And that's how we took it. It took a good chunk of the day to be aware of it. I think the epicenter was in Gurkha, in or around Gurkha. As we would go over and back base camp, we become aware of how bad it is at base camp. Slowly but surely, you become aware the numbers are starting to increase, and you can visually see how bad the situation has become. And then you get these reports to say, well, I think we got a report to say that the runway in Kathmandu has been split in two. and that much of Kathmandu has been destroyed. So you're getting these confused picture about how we knew it was big in the rest of the country, but a lot of the reports we're getting, it was fog of war stuff, and it was right. Should we believe that? Are we better off staying where we are? And then it takes a while before you become aware that there's many thousands across Nepal that have been, because your first reaction is this has happened here, and then you have to kind of figure out, well, no, this has happened everywhere, and we're just one tiny piece of this whole story. But it does take a while. It takes a while because you're in the act of trying to assist the rescue and recovery that's going on that day.
I asked Paul a potentially silly question next, but one that had been in my mind all along, given the experience Paul had gone through the previous year, in 2014, about the decision to leave Everest. Was it just taken as read, given the devastation, or was it something that was even discussed?
At the moment it happened and you do your walk across base camp, it's immediate. This is over. Because the logistics of getting the icefall, I mean, if you park the human tragedy side of it, the logistics of getting the icefall back into condition, so that you could, fix ladders and be confident. You have very little confidence about what the area from Camp 1 to Camp 2 is like across the crevasse field. You don't know what's happened further up the mountain. Everything's been shut loose. It turns out that the Hillary Step was shut loose. So like all of that stuff is just unknown. So as far as you're concerned, everyone else is concerned, this is the end. And you have a moment, I remember a second where you do selfishly think, bugger. And then you snap out of it immediately. And I think because you're in it rather than divorced from it, that's an easier road to travel, if I could say. And certainly for me, because the experience of base camp, those couple of days, and then walking very slowly down through the valleys that were completely empty, and then you get back to Kathmandu, and I spent about 3 weeks doing relief work with Nepal, Ireland in Kathmandu, and that was an eye-opener, seeing the villages, how decimated they were, seeing the anger of people who had nobody come to help them, and they're angry at you because you only bought a small number of stuff for them. And there's a whole lot of stuff there that opened your eyes as to the effect this has had on the wider population, and seeing how positive the Nepalese were about rebuilding and getting themselves back on track. It helps you process what you've been through, and then it helps you process the little selfish piece of you that's trying to deal with the fact that your expedition's gone as well. I remember walking out of base camp, and there was an American expedition owner who was standing over the body bag of his girlfriend who had been killed. She was a doctor at base camp. And I remember thinking, damn this, I never want to come back here. And that was just an impulse. I mean, this was an event that's different and separate from any of what's a normal expedition on Everest. And you have to separate the things out, and it takes a little bit of time to separate them out and to not take it all personally and to not be angry at it. But yeah, it does change part of your personality. I think it has an effect on you. It gave me a lot of hope to see how effective people were at emergency support on base camp, when it happened. It showed me how capable the climbing community are. Okay, there's spots of inexperience all over the place, but there's a heck of a lot of experience too, and there's a heck of a lot of capability in that group to get on and to solve big problems. This was a big problem, and that gave me a lot of hope. And then to just see the Nepalese dealing with it, the tent, that the entire center of Kathmandu, the big park, was just a tent city. The tents had all been supplied by the Chinese government. There were beautiful big tents. There was one little shitty tent. I went and put my head into it, and there was guys in it studying Korean so they could go to Korea and work there and earn money to send back to rebuild their house. And I thought, well, if that isn't resilience, I don't know what is. And we just encountered so much positivity and resilience among the population that it rubbed off on you. And it definitely meant that if you were starting to feel sorry for yourself, for the situation you found yourself in, you snapped out of that fairly quickly. And I think that has stayed with me.
As is often the case, when circumstances are at their worst, people are at their best. But for Paul, the dream of Everest in 2015 was gone, A cruel blow personally for him, given the experience in 2014, although of course the earthquake had been catastrophic for Nepal, which brings perspective. But the mountain is still there, and I asked Paul about how long it was closed for.
No, it was shut down just for the year. And then, of course, 2016 became the year where people found out what the mountain was like and what had happened up high, because nobody had been up for that. And that's where you find that the Hillary Step is gone and all these other things. So, yeah, it was back in action in 16 and busier than ever. If you look at the history of disasters on Everest, the year following the disaster is invariably the busiest year on Everest. So that was the case in 2016. Some of the people from 15 came back and done it again. I think for me, going back again was just going to be, just for a number of reasons, was going to be too difficult. I didn't feel I was ready to go back to that place. I wasn't financially going to be able to go back and try this again. And, time was buzzing on and there was other things that needed to be done, including work. So I made the decision not to go back and to push it off into the future at some point. But yeah, it was back open, and it needed to be back open for the locals as well. There's a lot of families up and down the valleys that require that mountain to be open so that they can make a living and send their kids to school and raise the entire floor of the valley so that there's greater opportunity. It's a double-edged sword, the fact that it's such a great source of income for the locals, because yes, it is, but at a price. They pay a heavy price. Their options aren't fabulous. Do Everest and get money, or don't do Everest and head overseas and work on the building sites in Qatar or somewhere like that. So it's not an incredibly good set of options. And those that do it, the allure to do it is so strong that it overpowers the sense of danger that exists, and especially young Sherpa that have to cut their teeth as well, and they have to get their CV going, and they have to get their summits to be, to be useful for the bigger expedition teams. I sometimes think, look at this, is that a very healthy merry-go-round that we've all created where, yes, this is very effective in creating opportunity, but are the Sherpa now stuck in that circle where they can't get out of it? I think if you ask most Sherpa, they would probably say that they would love to do jobs that give them a great living that don't exist at 8,000 meters or with a ton of risk. And the fact is that right now in Nepal, there aren't those opportunities, especially out in the valleys. So I'm very aware all the time when I'm promoting Everest that you're partly promoting that merry-go-round a little bit. And it's very difficult. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of the next generation beyond them are getting the opportunity to go to schools that they wouldn't get the opportunity to go to get an education that wouldn't be available to them otherwise, and to have an opportunity to go on and be what they want to be. So eventually, Nepal will be a place where the locals will not have any interest in putting themselves at risk by going into the high mountains.
Each generation of parents strives to provide more opportunities and a better life for their children. I think this is true all over the world, but it doesn't always work out like that. I find it hard to imagine a time when the Everest season isn't something that many local people in the Khumbu Valley will depend on for their livelihood, though maybe the Sherpa that do choose to take the risk of the high mountains are those that are beginning to take a measure of control over their own lives by setting up companies offering guiding services, usually at a much lower cost than Western-style companies. From an Irish point of view, Paul's website, irish7summits.com, does an excellent job in documenting the attempts of Irish mountaineers not just on Everest, but on many other peaks around the world. I asked Paul what inspired him to set it up.
I suppose some of the preparation I was doing to try and understand the mountain. When you're scraping through all that preparation, you're becoming aware of how many people have climbed it, which was something I wasn't aware of. You're aware of the few names that pop up that people might know readily, but I wasn't aware, that, it's been climbed by almost 60 Irish people at this point, and it's been climbed about 76 times by those folks. So, there's a lot of that. That's an interesting thing to find out. And then the other interesting thing is, well, who climbed it and didn't make it? And how far did they get? And I found that a curious thing to try and investigate as well, because the stories behind how people get to 8,000 meters or 8,500 meters and don't make it to the summit are sometimes just as fascinating as the stories of the people who get to the top. Um, and I found that's a useful thing to understand. So I think that preparation kind of spawned the lists, which spawned the history. And I mean, there's a lot of folks who, Frank Nugent's one in particular, who's written some great books and has a great interest in the history of Everest going right back to the start. And, he talks about the early expeditions and about 1921 and 1924 and about the part played by Irishmen in some of those early expeditions as well. And the fact that the first reconnaissance expedition to look at Everest and the climate of Everest was led by a man from Mullingar. And so there is a history there. We have a history in the mountains, which we've a little bit inherited from our neighbors, I suppose. And I found a lot of it is very informative for somebody who goes there to know a little bit about the history of the mountain, to know a little bit about why Irish people will bother going and climbing this, to know a little bit about to what extent the Irish climb Everest. And we do punch above our weight in that regard. And what sort of success rates do people from sea level have when they wander over to try and climb the highest mountain in the world? So that kind of all coalesced into what you see, that rabbit hole that you see. When we were doing Killy, we wanted to raise some funds for some of the areas that we're going into in Tanzania, and we found that was rewarding. And we found that people would respond if you were doing something like that. I don't personally like the model where you raise sponsorship money and part of it goes to your expedition and part of it goes to the charity. When we raised it for the charity, it went to the charity. And the funds for these expeditions went from, mostly ourselves. So it's personally rewarding, which is, I guess, a little bit selfish, but we found that you will get a response from the public for this sort of stuff, and that response can be used to help others. And then we had some personal interest in some of the reasons why we were collecting money for some causes, whether it was that we knew people that had been directly affected by some of the children's charities that we were collecting for. So there was always a story that wound back to us and to people that we knew. And that kind of was why we chose some of the charities we chose, like Laurel Lane and Liam's Lodge. And we just found that why not? Why wouldn't you use something it's going to get you some publicity? You're going to be able to push it out there and get a lot of interest. Why wouldn't you use that? Why wouldn't you tag along? By the way, would you mind donating to these guys?
We are coming to the end of our interview with Paul, but I wanted to ask him about something that has become very clear to me over the course of this series, and something that comes through on Paul's website: the risk involved in climbing Everest and the loss that goes along with that.
Yeah, it's a hard question. Obviously, there's a few Irish people, Shay and Noel being among them, and that haven't come back from these expeditions. And they were very capable people, and they didn't come home. So it's very difficult. I spend a lot of time thinking about the people at home and how they must feel about us mountaineers doing this, and whether it eventually ferments some resentment about the whole thing, because it's taken away their loved ones. And I could certainly understand if it did. But I think most people who are married to or who are part of a family with people who do this and have done it for many years, get to understand the psyche of why the person is doing it and what sort of a grip it might have on them. Because everything you're passionate about has some sort of a grip on you. And so I think that it gives people a lot of solace to know that somebody died doing what they love. But again, if objectively it's senseless to go out and climb big, dangerous mountains, and objectively it's senseless to go out and lose your life while trying to climb big, dangerous mountains. But, whether it's getting in a Formula One car or whether it's going up on a mountain or whatever it is you want to do that gives you a thrill in life, there is going to be some danger associated with it. And most people try and mitigate the danger as much as they humanly can and embrace the risk as much as they humanly can, because understanding the risk and understanding the nature of the risk helps keep you alive. It helps keep your adrenaline exactly where it needs to be. I don't like folks who just blindly think that something is entirely possible without looking at the fact that it's dangerous and you can die, and therefore you have to study and analyze that part of it too. I think that the risk is in that part of it, and you have to understand and embrace the risk to make yourself safer on the mountain. Because when you understand and embrace the risk, you're able to identify things around you that might be blind to you otherwise. And I think it's a very important part of it. So I think for all the families of the people who have gone there and not come back, I mean, they'll have understood the risk, and they'll have understood that their loved one understood the risk, and that their loved one really wanted to do that thing and died in the pursuit of something they were passionate about. And I hope that that's a comfort, though I can understand in a lot of cases how it might seem very senseless. I do want to go back and I do want to finish it, but it's a more complicated mountain to climb now, even than it was in 2015. There's many more people there now. I think the stats are out for this season, and this season has been the deadliest season on Everest. It's now matched 2015 in terms of numbers, and that's without a natural disaster. So, there's a story in there that you had better understand if you're going to go to Everest. The logistics of being in crowds, it's a different mountain to think about. And I have to work out how to do that. And you've also got to get the fire in your belly to the right place. If you're not more passionate about climbing Everest than you are about anything on earth, you should not go and climb Everest. So you have to have a burning passion to do it, to get through all of the difficulty you're going to encounter. And so I have got to start to get that love back again in the same way that I had it before. And it does wane. It doesn't stay consistent. It does wane a little bit. You've got to get out into the hills and you've got to get it back again. So I have a few little peaks that I'm going to consider. There was a peak that a guy who died on Everest, Kevin Hines from Galway, he told me about a peak in India called Nun Peak, N-U-N. And he said it's the most magical place he ever climbed. And I'm keen to go and discover what that's about. And there's a lot of other peaks I want to try and do, and I have to get my skill set back, and I have to feel that level of proficiency that I felt, and I have to improve on that level of proficiency because I'm older, and I have more things. I have kids now, and I have more things that play into your mind that plus I'm going for a third time, and the psychology of going for a third time versus a second and first is very different. You can create false pressure for yourself. You can create a sense of having to push on regardless when your body might be telling you to stop. So there's a whole lot of hidden dangers that come with going for a third time, which is why I find the people who have gone 2, 3, 4, 5 times and then I find their story, or even not made it, I find their story fascinating because there's a psychological element to that that's quite unique. So like I said before about opportunity, the opportunity, you have to create it. It's a very complex thing to create financially, logistically, and for a range of other reasons. And the mountain is becoming more complex as well. So I don't know when, but I guess I've put 20-something. So it's in the 2020s. But I do want to go back and finish that. It has been my goal, and I know it's a bit bucket listy, but we all have goals in life, and I think it's good to try and see your goals through.
I will certainly be keeping an eye on Irish 7 summits and Paul to see if he manages to get the third chance to go to Everest and fulfill his dream of climbing Everest and completing the 7 summits. I hope you enjoyed our interview with Paul. Please join us again next week for another episode of the Why the Mountains podcast. We are approaching the end of the first series, but there are still a few interviews left to edit and a couple more I want to get in the can before the end of the series. So hopefully you can stay with us. In the meantime, stay safe and stay cool.